Welcome to CAA's webinar on fair use in the visual arts. This webinar is the first in a 5-part series. It's designed to introduce the visual arts community, the CAA's newly published Code of Best Practices in Fair Use for the Visual Arts. The series is being presented by Professors Peter Yazzie and Pat Aufderheide at American University. They are two of the principal investigators in the creation of the code. Each webinar will thoroughly discuss specific sections of the Fair Use Code: analytic writing, teaching, art practice, museums, and archives. The final webinar will offer a review of the entire document. For those who do not have a copy of the code, please use the URL on the screen, and you will find a link on that page to register for the rest of the webinars if you haven't already done so. CAA is offering a certificate of participation for attending all 5 webinars. Based on attendance reports generated by the registration records, certificates will be mailed to eligible participants to the addresses indicated on the registration forms. Questions can be submitted in the chat box of your control panel. Over 550 people have registered for this webinar, so questions will be addressed only as time permits. This Fair Use initiative is funded by a major grant from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation with support from the Crest Foundation. Fees for this series have been waived thanks to the Mellon Foundation. On behalf of CAA, I'd like to thank Professors Peter Yazzie and Pat Aufderheide for presenting this important series. I now turn the webinar over to them.
And Linda, am I now the presenter?
Yes.
Wonderful. Then what I'm going to do is enable screen sharing, I hope. Yes, show my screen. Now my question is, can people see the first slide of the presentation, Fair Use in the Visual Arts?
I can.
Let's hope they can. If not, somebody write in that you can't. So here's what we want to get done today. And this is, don't forget, the very introduction to the presentation. So we won't be going into some of these issues in great depth, but we're going to talk first of all about why fair use is important in the visual arts. Second, give you the fair use basics. Third, talk about the logic of having a code of best practices rather than some other solution to making clear what your fair use rights are. We're going to talk specifically about what is in the CAA code. We're going to give ourselves a little quiz, and we're going to test the knowledge that we've developed in the course of the hour. We're going to show you some more resources, and then we're going to make sure that we harvest not only the questions that you've already given us, but the questions that come up in the course of the presentation to make sure that in future webinar presentations we're able to get to them all. So let's talk first of all about why it's so important for CAA members to address fair use issues. There's a really simple answer to that, which is that when we talk to museum professionals, teachers, professors, scholars, editors, what they said was 70% of them said in their daily lives they use copyrighted material a lot. And actually that included a fair amount of artists. So when we talked to these people, and we did a survey with almost 3,000 of you, as well as doing in-depth interviews with around 100 people, the most common situations in encountering a need for fair use were the ones we talked about that are on the screen. When people are writing about art, particularly in scholarly situations, when they're teaching, when they are doing their work in museums, when they're making art, and also when they face documentation issues, particularly in archives and collections. So when they face those issues, this is what they often look like? The question comes up now, what do I do?
Muted.
And what happens when you face that uncertainty is that the work often doesn't actually get done. We heard a lot about delay. We heard a lot about costs. We heard a lot about frustration, about having to negotiate extensively with people and how frustrating that was. But the thing that we most noticed was that 1/3 of you told us that you had either avoided or abandoned work because of copyright concerns. And we had some notion of what kind of work you abandoned because you could tell us about that. But often it was hard for you to tell us what kinds of things you might have avoided because you'd often simply written them off as impossible long ago and not even included them in your possible to-do list. So we saw a real loss of mission capacity in the community because of uncertainty about how to manage copyright issues. We saw, in fact, that the biggest problem was self-censorship. Again, we heard people talk about many problems. Well, it's difficult to deal with estates, and brokers are often a challenge to deal with. Sometimes I don't know where to get copyrighted material. The costs are very high when I have to write an article and I have to pay thousands of dollars for images. But the biggest problem that we encountered was people actually not knowing if they could do something and therefore changing their own plans about what to do. In other words, self-censorship. Which leads us to want to understand more clearly what fair use is and when would be an appropriate time to use it and when should you use your permissions. And this is where I'll turn it over to my colleague, the real lawyer in the group, Peter Yassi.
So the fair use doctrine in U.S. copyright law has been around for a long time, since the middle of the 19th century, and it exists in service of the constitutional purpose of copyright law, which is, of course, in the United States, the promotion of the making and the dissemination of culture. In this country, we don't, let's see, I cannot advance the slide from here. So in this country, we don't have copyright specifically to improve anyone's life situation or any business interest security. We have it to promote the creation and, of course, the dissemination of culture. And to that end, there are a couple of broad features of copyright law that are significant. We accomplish this broad purpose, on the one hand, through the instrumental device of rewarding creators with a limited monopoly and giving them some promise of a return and some security in their economic situation. But at the same time, against that, we also balance encouragements for makers of new culture, be they artists or teachers or museum professionals or other, to make reasonable use of what has gone before, reasonable use of existing culture. And there are many balancing features in the copyright statute, the idea expression distinction and the exceptions in 108 and 110. But by all odds, the most significant is the fair use doctrine that got codified in 1976 in Section 107 of the Act. And at the highest possible level of generality, what Section 107 says is that sometimes unauthorized, unlicensed use of copyrighted material may be non-infringing if certain considerations are taken into account. And the statutory account of those considerations is found, of course, in the so-called 4 factors. This is what the statute tells us are the considerations that a user ought to think about at a minimum, not an exclusive list or an exhaustive list, but an illustrative list, And there are also the considerations that, for example, a court might think about after the fact if a use undertaken without license or permission was challenged, why the use was made, what was the goal or purpose of it, what kind of work was used, is it fanciful or factual in character, how much was used, and of course the economic effect that the use might have. And that's very comprehensive, and at the same time it tends to be potentially quite confusing because these factors aren't weighted or otherwise organized in any hierarchy in the statute. And so courts have struggled over time with how to interpret this statutory list. For a while, right after 1978, courts were frequently deciding that really economic interests, the fourth factor interests that we've got here up on the screen, were the most important. But then, starting in the late 1980s and continuing through the mid-90s when the change was kind of fully consolidated, and then up to and continuing in the present day, the case law around fair use has taken a very interesting new turn. And in the kinds of use situations that are the subject matter of this code, these days, functionally, not always in these so many words, but functionally, courts engage in a somewhat simpler analysis. And they do that in part because we've recognized in our jurisprudence in the last several years that fair use is a right, and that it's actually a right, a user's right, very closely connected to the use rights that are articulated at a constitutional level in the First Amendment. I think that's partly why we've seen such a big change in interpretation. There are other reasons too, but the outcome is what we need to focus on today. And that is that functionally, again, not in so many words, but functionally, judges today approach most fair use questions by making use of two inquiries. And the first is an inquiry into the nature of the purpose of the work. The Supreme Court has made it very clear that why a use, the purpose of the use. The Supreme Court has made it very clear that why a use takes place is by all means the most important consideration in this area. And if I could have the next slide, I will go to that and mention that the question of purpose is then further localized in contemporary judicial decisions around the question of whether or not a particular use has a transformative purpose. That is, does it address a new audience? Does it add value? Is it non-substitutional? Is the user doing something different or more with the work than its original creator intended? And in order for a use to be fair, or let me put it differently, when a use is found to be transformative in character, that doesn't get the user all the way home on fair use. There's another big question, and that is whether or not the amount of material used in quantity or in quality or both is appropriate to the purpose. But when the answer to these two questions is in the affirmative, then generally the use is determined to be fair. Now, in some situations where the demonstration of transformative use isn't so clear, economic considerations may still enter into fair use analysis. And in any event, whenever judges have before them fair use cases, they take into account other kinds of information as well. And so we know from the earliest times to the present day, when U.S. federal judges have been confronted with copyright questions around fair use that deal with new situations that haven't previously been before them, they look to see what the custom, the practice, the articulated values of the particular use community are. So if it's a fair use case, as the very first fair use case ever decided was about biography, the court asks, is the defendant in this case, the one who's asserting fair use, a real legitimate biographer? Is he or she acting within the norms that the community of biographers have defined for themselves, or, as it turned out in that case, is this individual an outlier, a parasite rather than a genuine biographer? And so on and so forth over years and decades through many, many other categories of use. And it's really this idea, this notion, that articulations of consensus values and practices within use communities has meaning, value, and weight that has given rise to the larger project out of which the CAA code grows. Pat?
So the question comes, if what Peter Jaszi says is true, then why aren't we all just using fair use much more completely than we are? Because judges appear to be fully in support of it, and the law certainly is widely encouraging of it. So what we heard from you was that you perceive there to be some real and frightening risks to you. There is the question of whether you will get into legal trouble, but actually this was not always or even commonly the biggest problem for you. People were also concerned about disturbing relationships that they had built up and having their reputations be marred by making a decision that was out of conformity with what was expected in the community. And this risk, it grows from the uncertainty that we talked about earlier, the uncertainty that leads to self-censorship. And this is why we routinely remind people of the kinds of risks that are in play here. And one is that there are real risks. There are not only legal risks assumed when you exercise your rights, not just fair use, but any of your expressive rights. You also assume risk associated with your reputation and with relationships. That is true. The other kind of risk, the self-censorship risk, is something that that we routinely saw people forgetting about, which was, what is the risk to me of not actually doing my job the way it should really be done? And so when you employ your rights, you always balance those issues. I could, of course, get in some trouble, and of course, if I don't take this action, what is the risk to my professional responsibilities? And that's where people in the past have come to best practices codes. The first people to do this with Peter Jaszi and myself were documentary filmmakers who, as you can see, worked through 5 national professional associations to establish their best practices. And others who have in the ensuing years done so include communication scholars, poets, librarians, academic and research librarians, and many more people, including dance archivists and people who write open courseware. And all of these are on the Center for Media and Social Impact site that you'll see at the end of the slideshow, in case you want to see how other professions have conducted their work. So what happens when they have a code of best practices? They're able to do that risk assessment that I was just talking about more efficiently. They're able to make a balance between any risks they might assume from asserting their rights and the risks from not doing their work. Right. So some of the examples include that within a year of creating their code of best practices, documentary filmmakers who previously could not get insurance for their films if they had a fair use claim in them, now found that they were able to get their work insured, and that work is now insured typically without incurring any extra cost for fair use claims. Librarians were able to digitize and post onto the net collections and be able to recruit people to add metadata to them and identify things that had been obscure items in their collections. Scholars have been able to convince publishers that applying their fair use rights was appropriate for their scholarly needs, and they were able to publish work with the appropriate illustrations. And archivists have been able to put entire digital exhibits online. To give you a few examples, the films that I'm showing you here are examples of examples of films that either could not have been made at all or could not have been made in the style that they've been made if they had not vigorously employed their fair use rights. And perhaps the most dramatic example is the one right in the middle. This film is not yet rated, which is about the MPAA's rating restrictions and employs 134 uncleared fair use clips in it. And the author, Kirby Dick, the director, was sincerely hoping to get a cease and desist letter so that he could put it on the DVD and tell people, I am employing my fair use rights, because he's that kind of a guy. But turns out he never got any, because all of the 6 studios involved understood perfectly well what his fair use rights were. The University of Colorado in Boulder has been able to tell professors who wanted to use an old material from some old VHS tape, yes, we can burn you a copy of the VHS to a DVD player so that you can use it in your classroom, which no longer has a VHS player in it, even though the VHS tape is not, strictly speaking, already decayed enough to qualify for another section of the copyright law, which would be preservation. This book from the University of Chicago features many, many examples of graphic designs of ephemeral press from the 1960s, and some of which were orphan works, and many of which were cleared under fair use. This is an example of a digital exhibit done by Jacob's Pillow, a firm that does dance, and it's drawn from their archive, and it allows you to see examples of dance online for, searching in these 3 categories. So I would now like to talk about how CAA's code was created, because the CAA's code was created on the same basis that all the other ones were created. The first step was to create a nationwide fact-finding expedition. And this was where we talked to 3,000, we did a 3,000-person survey, and we did long-form interviews with 100 people. And the report is online on CAA's website and on several other websites as well. As a result of doing that study, which took us a year, we were able to hear from people about those 5 areas that we talked about at the very beginning of the PowerPoint presentation, that the 5 most common situations in which people found that that the issues of whether they could use fair use came up. We took those 5 situations and we held discussion sessions in 5 cities. They were half-day sessions, and we brainstormed with people that the CAA had chosen to be in the room as a representative sample of the different fields. We brainstormed with them about how they would interpret their fair use rights in these 5 situations. These were the confidential meetings in which we were able to understand what was the growing consensus. Each meeting informed the next meeting. We were able, once we had a draft, to get input from our other PIs, our other principal investigators, as well as from the Fair Use Task Force organized by CAA. The entire product was reviewed by an advisory committee which was not associated from the start with the project. And these were, in fact, the situations that were that the group decided were the most common and the most appropriate to talk about. Now, this is where I will turn it over to my colleague, Peter Yassi, to talk about how distinctive this approach is and why it's so important to have this kind of an approach.
The fair use best practices documents that, let me get back to my camera. There we are. The fair use best practices documents that Pat has been describing, of which this is the most recent and one of the most significant iterations, are quite different from other circulating information, other guidance documents relating to fair use that are available in the world. They aren't guidelines in the sense that they don't purport to or aspire to provide specific metrics, measures of exactly how many lines or how many inches or how many chapters or any other metric of a copyrighted work can be subject to fair use. That approach, which has been tried, has not yielded a very useful result for practice communities of the kind that we have worked with over the last 10 years. Instead of a set of rules, arbitrary limits on fair use, what these best practices seek to provide, and we obviously hope succeed in providing, is a way of thinking, a pattern of analysis, a set of steps and considerations to be taken into account in arriving at a decision about whether a given use is or isn't fair, a decision that's robust and defensible and as free as is reasonably possible from associated risk. And they are not negotiated with rights holders or organizations that represent rights holders. In fact, they are the outcome, they are of, by, and for the community in question. In this case, the visual arts community is represented by CAA. We aren't, therefore, representing these consensus principles as being the views of anyone other than this unique visual arts community, which consists, as was so clearly demonstrated from meeting to meeting, of individuals who at one and the same time own and value their ownership of copyright, and on the other hand understand that in order to pursue their personal and professional missions, they need to make reasonable use of pre-existing materials. So this is a consensus document of the community, not a negotiation between CAA on the one hand and other entities or organizations on the other. The front matter of the code, as you can see from your copies, is descriptive of many of the points that we have already touched on relating to the process and the purpose of this approach to fair use reasoning. But the business part of the code, so to speak, is the set of 5 principles and associated limitations, one relating to each of the common recurrent situations that Pat described and illustrated earlier. So each of the subsections of the code proper begins with a description of that situation and the ways in which copyright issues that may be amenable to fair use solutions arise in it, whether the situation is writing about art or teaching about art or making art or using images and text in a museum context or organizing a collection of art documentation online. We begin with a description. That description is followed by the statement of a broad principle relating to the application, the general applicability of fair use in that class of circumstances. And then finally and critically, arguably most important of all, each general statement of applicability with respect to fair use is followed by a set of limitations, and it is these limitations which, as you can imagine, were the main substance and the development or further articulation of which was the main point of interest in the small group discussions that gave rise to this code. And the intimate limitations and the principles are entirely integral. One can't rely on the principle without at the same time considering the associated limitations.
And that's why that little blue triangle it contains all three, because they all go together.
Exactly.
So we thought that this might be the moment to send you back to the code to answer this question. For my academic article comparing the work of two major later 20th century painters, I have acceptable quality reproductions of the work compared. The journal that I want to get published in says authors must get permissions for illustrations. So there are two questions. Do I need to get permission legally? And what do I say to the journal? We'd like to give you a poll. And actually, Hillary, are you able to access the poll? Because when I click on it, it's refusing to give me something. Thank you. Would you just take that poll before we actually go to any data and see what we just think? And the question, of course, is legally would I need permission to be able to illustrate this academic article? We're still getting votes. If you haven't voted, now is the moment. Okay, so I see that with 85% of the people voting, the majority of you say, yes, I could do this. I'm sorry, the question says, do I legally need to get permission? Is that right? I'm unable to see the question, Hillary.
That was the question.
Okay, do I legally need to get permission? And 60% of you say, yep, oops, sorry, I better get permission. And 44% of you think that you don't need to get permission. Well, let's take a look at the code itself. So if you have a copy of the code, go to the code and take a look at the section 1. If you don't, go you can follow me as I take a look at analytic writing. And I'm going to skip the description, which includes a lot of interesting information on how widely academic writing, analytic writing could be done, both in academic and non-academic settings. I'm going to focus on principle. Scholars and other writers may invoke fair use to quote, excerpt, and reproduce copyrighted works. And here's the limitations. Your use of the work should be justified by the analytic objective. I hope you're reading along with me. Number 2, your analytic objective should be more important than just your desire to show nice pictures. You should consider how much or how big or how completely in color this thing should be. And you should really think carefully when you're thinking about born digital works, because sometimes you could just reproduce it and it could become a substitute for the original. So think about that. But here you're dealing with later 20th century works, and reproductions of works should represent the original works as accurately as can be achieved, so that you can honestly say this is a good reproduction of what I'm talking about. And of course, you should attribute, right? It's always polite, as well as a good idea for good relationships, to provide citations.
And if I may jump in for a second.
Yes, please.
The point about attribution is very interesting, because if you look to the copyright case law or to the statute itself, you don't find anything there about attribution. It isn't a classic legal consideration in fair use decision making. But from the time that we began to do the codes of best practices with different practice communities almost 12 years ago, this has been uniformly something on which each professional group with which we have worked has had extremely strong feelings. Because for them, and now for the visual arts community, doing fair use right isn't just a matter of fitting oneself into some kind of preconceived and pre-understood legal framework. It's also a matter of behaving well, behaving ethically, and behaving professionally. And we frequently include, because these codes are, again, of, by, and for the communities, we include these considerations which could be thought of as extra-legal in nature, but are fundamental from the standpoint of community values. This is a good example.
So I'd love for you to take a look at this question again and measure it up against those limitations that we just talked about. Now, obviously, the principle says very clearly that you can employ fair use for such work such as a scholarly article to illustrate it. What you now want to do is just take a look at those limitations. And Hillary, could you open up the second version of this? And when you're ready, when you've done that, vote again. Thank you. Hillary, can you open it up again? I don't think so. Okay, so we have 70% of you having voted that time. Yes, and now 84% of you believe that you have the right to employ fair use. There are still 16% of you who say, I think I'm going to need to clear this. And if you can put quickly into a chat box why you think that you need to clear this in spite of what the code says, just let us know.
And while you're doing that, I would say one thing, and that is that the assumption, really, on which I suspect that many of you voted no in this round, is that the limitations that we discussed a moment ago were in fact satisfied by this use. And that's a very important assumption, because it's also possible to imagine versions or variants of this example in which, for whatever reason, one or more of those limitations might not have been met. Attribution might not have been properly provided, or the reproduction in question might have been of extremely poor quality, or the real purpose behind the use might have been more decorative than analytic. So as I say, I want to underline that a no vote on the second round must, in my view, carry with it an assumption that those important limitations have in fact been satisfied.
And the caveat that Peter has provided here is a really important one, because these are These are obviously sketchy examples in which we really haven't filled out well. You know, what is it that you're going to say, and how is it clear in the article, for instance, that you you need this is the appropriate picture for you to use as an illustration for your argument. Of course, that would be clear in the argument that you were making, and you might even want to reinforce that in a caption. But I actually, and Hillary, here's where I cannot see any chat comments. So if there are any, I'm sorry,
arrow.
I'm not seeing
them.
Pardon?
I've just.
They should be in the questions area.
In the questions area.
Not the chat.
Okay, let's go to questions. Good.
I can see questions, but I can't see answers for why we why you voted the way you did.
I see the last, but it's only a yes without explanation.
We need to refine this capability as we go forward, but what I'd like to do now is go on to the next question. So in question number 2, you're now an art teacher, and you have the lucky job of teaching the intro class. And everybody's helped you, and you've got a lot of your own slides, and so people have given you some slides that they've used to teach from, and you've got lots of photos, and it's quite a collection, and there's a wide variety of copyright status here. Some of them maybe you don't even know. So can I use material that I'm going to teach from on my class's passworded website so that not only not only in class can I teach from it, but so that they can prep and study after, so that they can prepare, they can research, and they can also study afterwards. And that's all good. Now I'm going to the code again, and now I'm going to teaching about art. So if you don't have your own copy, I believe you can look on with me. Again, we have a longish, I'm sorry. Oh, the poll. You are so right. Yes. Let's take the poll. So, and Hillary, could you launch the poll for number 2? And here the question is, and the way that I phrased the question may not be as helpful. The question is, can I use fair use to legally put artwork on our class's passworded website? In other words, do I have to clear it? The question is phrased positively. You would say yes if you think you can employ fair use to put artwork on this passworded website without getting permissions. And Hillary, you can give it another few seconds. So if you're going to vote, vote now. Well, you know, 85% if you voted the last time. I'm sure we can make it to 85%.
Well, we're at 82.
All right, that may do it. So thank you, Hillary. 91% of you said yes. This is a place where I can employ fair use, and a few of you said no, 9%. So let's go to the fair use code, which says yes, you may use fair use in using copyrighted works of various kinds to promote formal instruction in a range of settings, as well as for uses that extend such teaching and for reference collections that support it. And then there's a list of limitations. I'm going to let you go ahead and read those limitations.
as you read, there's a point I might make in passing. I think a common misunderstanding about fair use is that simply because a use is educational, it is by virtue of that fact necessarily fair. And although those of us who work in education might wish that that is so, it isn't. In fact, educational uses are evaluated as other uses are on a multi-factor balancing test. And so in educational use, as elsewhere, it's very important in making appropriate use of this code as a guidance document to remember that the limitations are integral to the principle. The principle supporting educational fair use is categorically stated, but it is stated subject to a variety of non-trivial limitations.
So if we go back to the question, we would be applying those limitations to this, and we'd be thinking, well, he's putting it on the website, so and it's for the class, so he is limiting it to the class. It's passworded, so it's not going to be easy for other people to get access to it. He said relevant, so that means he's got some argument for why he needs this particular stuff to teach that particular thing. We hope he's attributing, don't we? We really think that that's also important.
Let me ask, is there anything that anyone thinks they would like to know about this use and this user before arriving at a definite conclusion? Anything that might relate to some of these articulated limitations? I'm assuming, again, that the place to write some inquiry of that kind would be under the questions heading in the menu of the webinar tool.
Oh, and someone has written, are these images downloadable?
A very interesting question, and one that, in the view of the members of the visual arts community, and again, I want to emphasize, we're talking not just about teachers here, but about artists and others who have strong copyright interests as well. In the view of the community, the question of the downloadability of the images and its relation to fair use had something to do with the kind and quality of the images themselves. It's the fifth bullet under limitations, and it asks if the images are downloadable, are they larger than would be necessary for satisfactory full screen projection or display on a computer or mobile device. If so, then that fact is going to weigh against fair use in the analysis that is suggested here. If not, then the consensus view of our groups was that it should be allowed.
So, and someone else has asked about the quality of personally taken photography.
That's a very interesting question, and it bears again on the notion of the representativeness of the images with respect to the works used. And were the images in question of a consistently low quality, if they misrepresented rather than represented the works, that might, although it isn't specifically, no, excuse me, it is in the fourth bullet, it is specifically referenced here, that might also be a knockout. Again, the main point I want to stress here is that even in a case like this, where our impulse may be to favor the use because of its educational character, the limitations mattered with respect to the groups we discussed. Now, does that mean that in the view of these groups, a use that fails to satisfy or to live up to one of these limitations is necessarily not fair? No, that was not the point of these discussions, nor does it characterize the outcome of these discussions. Clearly, there may be, I think probably in likelihood are, fair uses that a court might find that fall outside of the prescriptions that are contained in the code. This is the center of gravity. This is the relatively conservative consensus of the field. This is where a practitioner, if they choose to locate themselves here, can have a fairly strong sense of being in the herd rather than an outlier. And that may, of course, be important information.
So let's just vote one more time. Can I employ fair use to put this artwork on my website, given the concerns that we've raised? We're slowing down, but I know you can do it.
Now we're making everybody work.
All right, so we have a slightly smaller group who say no this time, and 94% say yes. And I'm assuming that those 6% have some question about whether the person who's doing this would meet their high standards for all of those limitations. Let's do one more. I think we can squeeze in one more before we round up. So this one is on art exhibition. Peter, would you like to introduce this one?
Sure. It's about an exhibition of graphic material from contemporary, that is, of the moment protest movements. And the idea is that the physical exhibit is going to have a accompanying web component on the museum's website, interactive, online, really in the nature of a catalog with some value added. Some of the art is born digital, some is ephemeral or was ephemeral, and some of it was created anonymously. And the curator who's putting together this online catalog wants to get as much as possible of the physical exhibit online to accompany it virtually. And the question, of course, is for the things that you've had trouble getting permission to use, trouble tracing, or trouble getting authorization for, do you need to seek permission, or, and that's the implicit question, can you make do with fair use? So in this case, I think permission needed is a yes, and fair use is a no. Is that right, Pat?
Let's go to the poll question and find out, wouldn't it have been smart of me to write this the right way in the first place?
Oh, I don't know. I think it's
let's see what the nature of this question is. So yes would be I need permission.
And no means fair use is available. This is a more complicated one, I will admit.
Okay, some of you are just getting tired of voting.
Well, we may be losing folks too.
Okay, 75%. All right, great. Okay, so Perfect. So what have you come to the conclusion of? 3/4 of you say you are going to need to get permissions for this, and 1/4 of you say, no, I think I can employ fair use. So let's go to the code and find out what the limitations would be for that somebody who was in this situation would want to consider. And Peter, do you want to walk through this?
Yeah, I can mention, for instance, that this is one question as to which the description that accompanies the principle is actually pretty relevant, because the description talks about the range of things that museums do today to enhance the experience of visitors, both real and virtual. And among those things, it makes clear, is that the practice of creating virtual catalogs or other kinds of virtual counterparts to physical exhibitions in the museum is a very common one. And with that aspect of the description in mind, one can then look to the principle, which again, in broad terms, but representing a very strong consensus across the community as a whole, not just curators, but everyone else who was polled and questioned and contributed, a very strong consensus in favor of the general principle that fair use does apply to these kinds of virtual museum activities. And that leads us inevitably, once again, to the limitations and to the question of whether those limitations are met. And I'm assuming that some of the skepticism in the first poll may have had to do with the concern about the question of whether those limitations would in fact have been satisfied. If we say, for instance, that there was attribution, if we say that metadata is being provided, if we say that the museum does identify a point of contact on this website to which anyone with a complaint or a concern is able to address themselves simply and easily, if we state and assume that visitors to the site are appropriately warned that reuse of this material in any form is their own responsibility, I wonder if the poll might change.
And we would love to know too. I'm not sure we have time, because I think only have time to close this session out.
But maybe we'll talk about this one again when we meet some of you in this virtual space another time for a more detailed consideration of the principles, including some good quality time concerning the principles that apply to museums.
So a concluding point we'd love to make is that fair use, and I'm quoting the nation's greatest expert on fair use, Peter Yassi, here when I say, fair use is like a muscle. It expands when you use it. So one thing we've seen in every one of the 9 other communities that have developed fair use codes is that when they use their fair use rights and word gets out in the community that somebody has been able to do this without incurring undue risk, practice changes. And that is actually a really important fact about freedom of expression generally, that the more freedom of expression is exercised, the more people are able to speak. So here are 2 places where you can get resources. I was at this site here, which has a number, it has all the resources that this site has as well, which is the College Art Association site. It has the code and all the ancillary resources, which include some teaching information, and you can also take a set of informal quizzes if you like. If you really wanted a lot more information on fair use, you could go to this book. I'm sorry, Peter?
Oh, no, I was just going to say that also on the 2 websites is a set of an FAQ document that we've prepared that we are pretty pleased with. We think it answers a lot of questions, and if, as we very much hope, you're going to come back and join us for future sessions, you might or might not want to include in your preparation for them some review of the relevant FAQs. We're also very, very interested always to know whether there are other issues that you think it might be helpful for us to address in that FAQ document, which is a living, organic thing.
So we would love to hear from you. Janet Lande, who's on this webinar as well, is the project manager. This is her address, so please get in touch with us through her. We are very grateful for your time. Thank you.
Thanks for spending the time with us.